take the Bible and read to me till peace came and settled upon me like sleep upon the eyelids of a child. And when at last she closed the book she'd say, 'We'll save them in spite of themselves.' And I felt strong again in the Lord, and I answered, 'Yes, with God's help I'll save them. I must save them.'" He came over to the table and stood in front of it as though it were a lectern. "You see, they were so naturally depraved that they couldn't be brought to see their wickedness. We had to make sins out of what they thought were natural actions. We had to make it a sin, not only to commit adultery, and to lie and thieve, but to expose their bodies, and to dance, and not to come to church. I made it a sin for a girl to show her bosom, and a sin for a man not to wear trousers." "How?" asked Dr Macphail, not without surprise. "I instituted fines. Obviously, the only way to make people realize that an action is sinful is to punish them if they commit it. I fined them if they didn't come to church, and I fined them if they danced. I fined them if they were improperly dressed. I had a tariff, and every sin had to be paid for, either in money or work. And at last I made them understand." "But did they never refuse to pay?" "How could they?" asked the missionary. "It would be a brave man who tried to stand up against Mr Davidson," said his wife, tightening her lips. Dr Macphail looked at Davidson with troubled eyes. What he heard shocked him, but he hesitated to express his disapproval. "You must remember that in the last resort I could expel them from their church membership." "Did they mind that?" Davidson smiled a little and gently rubbed his hands. "They couldn't sell their copra. When the men fished, they got no share of the catch. It meant something very like starvation. Yes, they minded quite a lot." "Tell him about Fred Olson," said Mrs Davidson. The missionary fixed his fiery eyes on Dr Macphail. "Fred Olson was a Danish trader who had been in the islands a good many years. He was a pretty rich man as traders go, and he wasn't very pleased when we came. You see, he had things very much his own way. He paid the natives what he liked for their copra, and he paid in goods and whiskey. He had a native wife, but he was flagrantly unfaithful to her. He was a drunkard. I gave him a chance to mend his ways, but he wouldn't take it. He laughed at me." Davidson's voice fell to a deep bass as he said the last words, and he was silent for a minute or two. The silence was heavy with menace. "In 2 years he was a ruined man. He'd lost everything he'd saved in a quarter of a century. I broke him, and at last he was forced to come to me like a beggar and beseech me to give him a passage back to Sydney." "I wish you could have seen him when he came to see Mr Davidson," said the missionary's wife. "He had been a fine, powerful man with a lot of fat on him, and he had a great big voice, but now he was half the size, and he was shaking all over. He'd suddenly become an old man." With abstracted gaze Davidson looked out into the night. The rain was falling again. Suddenly from below came a sound, and Davidson turned and looked questioningly at his wife. It was the sound of a gramophone, harsh and loud, wheezing out a syncopated tune. "What's that?" he asked. Mrs Davidson fixed her pince nez more firmly on her nose. "One of the second-class passengers has a room in the house. I guess it comes from there." They listened in silence, and presently they heard the sound of dancing. Then the music stopped, and they heard the popping of corks and voices raised in animated conversation. "I dare say she's giving a farewell party to her friends on board," said Dr Macphail. "The ship sails at 12, doesn't it?" Davidson made no remark, but he looked at his watch. "Are you ready?" he asked his wife. She got up and folded her work. "Yes, I guess I am," she answered. "It's early to go to bed yet, isn't it?" said the doctor. "We have a good deal of reading to do." explained Mrs. Davidson.
"Wherever we are, we read a chapter of the Bible before retiring for the night, and we study it with the commentaries, you know, and discuss it thoroughly. It's a wonderful training for the mind."
The two couples bade one another good night. Dr. and Mrs. McPhail were left alone. For 2 or 3 minutes they did not speak. "I think I'll go and fetch the cards," the doctor said at last. Mrs. McPhail looked at him doubtfully. Her conversation with the Davidsons had left her a little uneasy, but she did not like to say that she thought they had better not play cards when the Davidsons might come in at any moment. Dr. McPhail brought them and she watched him, though with a vague sense of guilt, while he laid out his patience. Below, the sound of revelry continued. It was fine enough next day, and the McPhails, condemned to spend a fortnight of idleness at Pago Pago, set about making the best of things. They went down to the quay and got out of their boxes a number of books. The doctor called on the chief surgeon of the naval hospital and went round the beds with him. They left cards on the governor. They passed Miss Thompson on the road. The doctor took off his hat, and she gave him a "Good morning, Doc," in a loud, cheerful voice. She was dressed as on the day before, in a white frock, and her shiny white boots with their high heels, her fat legs bulging over the tops of them, were strange things on that exotic scene.
"I don't think she's very suitably dressed, I must say," said Mrs. McPhail. "She looks extremely common to me."
When they got back to their house, she was on the veranda playing with one of the trader's dark children.
"Say a word to her," Dr. McPhail whispered to his wife. "She's all alone here, and it seems rather unkind to ignore her." Mrs. McPhail was shy, but she was in the habit of doing what her husband bade her. "I think we're fellow lodgers here," she said, rather foolishly.
"Terrible, ain't it, being cooped up in a one-horse burg like this?" answered Miss Thompson. "And they tell me I'm lucky to have gotten a room. I don't see myself living in a native house, and that's what some have to do. I don't know why they don't have a hotel." They exchanged a few more words. Miss Thompson, loud-voiced and garrulous, was evidently quite willing to gossip, but Mrs. McPhail had a poor stock of small talk, and presently she said, "Well, I think we must go upstairs." In the evening, when they sat down to their high tea, Davidson, on coming in, said, "I see that woman downstairs has a couple of sailors sitting there. I wonder how she's gotten acquainted with them."
"She can't be very particular," said Mrs. Davidson.
They were all rather tired after the idle, aimless day. "If there's going to be a fortnight of this, I don't know what we shall feel like at the end of it," said Dr. McPhail. "The only thing to do is to portion out the day to different activities," answered the missionary. "I shall set aside a certain number of hours to study and a certain number to exercise, rain or fine in the wet season you can't afford to pay any attention to the rain and a certain number to recreation." Dr. McPhail looked at his companion with misgiving. Davidson's program oppressed him. They were eating hamburger steak again. It seemed the only dish the cook knew how to make. Then, below, the gramophone began. Davidson started nervously when he heard it, but said nothing. Men's voices floated up. Miss Thompson's guests were joining in a well-known song, and presently they heard her voice too, hoarse and loud. There was a good deal of shouting and laughing. The four people upstairs, trying to make conversation, listened despite themselves to the clink of glasses and the scrape of chairs. More people had evidently come. Miss Thompson was giving a party.
"I wonder how she gets them all in," said Mrs. McPhail, suddenly breaking into a medical conversation between the missionary and her husband. It showed whither her thoughts were wandering. The twitch of Davidson's face proved that, though he spoke of scientific things, his mind was busy in the same direction. Suddenly, while the doctor was giving some experience of practice on the Flanders front, rather prosily, he sprang to his feet with a cry. "What's the matter, Alfred?"
asked Mrs. Davidson. "Of course! It never occurred to me. She's out of Iwelei."
"She can't be.